this is an enormous topic, and so really what I've tried to do is generalize predominantly and then try and give some interesting specific bits of information. And I'm happy to answer any questions that relate to obviously genetics, fitness, nutrition, supplements, health, pretty much anything. If anyone is cynical or anyone wants to debate anything or anything like that, I'm more than happy to. So you don't have to hold back with your questions. Also as well, at the bottom of this slide, the work that I've done with my company FitnessGenes, we've worked with a lot of universities, we've published, we've had a number of grants from the UK government for our work in innovation, intersecting science and technology. And what we're going to focus on in the talk is how to apply DNA analysis to exercise and nutrition for accelerated results, how to boost performance by genetically optimizing nitric oxide and caffeine, which are kind of two of the more specific things I figured we could go into, and how testosterone and other hormones can be influenced by a DNA test or a DNA analysis. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction about me and my background and FitnessGenes, if you like. I'm a medical doctor by background. I graduated in 2004 and worked as a clinical doctor for 10 years, predominantly in surgery and emergency medicine. While I was at medical school, I also trained as a personal trainer, did a sports nutrition qualification, human anatomy degree, and it was in 2011 that me and my best friend were talking about some gene variations that he, as a PhD geneticist, had found to be related to sports, endurance, strength, metabolic tendencies and things like that. And that kind of prompted us to kind of have this interest in whether or not we could actually use genetic information to tell people how to exercise and eat depending on their goals. So Stuart, the guy in the middle there, when I first suggested it, Stuart's a typical academic, and basically if you have any out of the box thinking, you're immediately slammed down and told you're an idiot. And that's pretty much what he did to me. No, Dan, you're an idiot, we can't do that. And then 2 weeks later, he called me and he said, actually, maybe we can, and we kind of started talking about it, and we kind of got started from there. So first off, who's actually done a DNA test? Any DNA test? Quite a few of you. So like 23andMe, Ancestry, other fitness ones, yeah? Most of us use the same technology, actually. So for 23andMe, FitnessGenes, Ancestry, we all use the same Illumina microarray panel. So the technologies are all very, very similar. But the genomics market now is obviously really, really huge. And people are now looking for more and more uses of gene information, of what we can actually do with it. There's always a risk that the more and more data that becomes accessible to us, the more we're paralyzed by it. And so a lot of kind of really cool gene companies now, whether it's for health, whether it's for fitness, we're really trying to figure out the ways that we can use not just genetic information, but all types of biological data to be able to drive the right actions for people to achieve their goals. Now, obviously for everyone here, you're all motivated individuals looking to hack your biology, and so there's obviously some really cool things you can figure out. It's probably about 80% of what we do is figuring out all that cool stuff, but 20% has to be about how we can apply this to the general population as well, where we're really trying to deal with lifestyle related illness, which is a huge impact and burden financially on economies at the moment. So just as a little bit of an introduction about really what we're looking at when we do a genetic test, or the best way to think about DNA, in fact. So we normally sort of recommend that you think about DNA like a recipe book, and then the individual pages are the individual genes, and it's the genes that code for proteins, and proteins essentially dictate things that your body should do. So it might be an enzyme, it might be a structural protein, it might be pigment in your skin, whatever it is, it's all driven by these individual genes. And so, for example, there's a gene called ACTN3 or actin-3. And ACTN3 codes for a protein called alpha-actinin-3. And alpha-actinin acts as a structural support within fast-twitch muscle. So when muscle contracts, there's these filaments that slide over each other, and alpha-actinin-3 acts as a support for that contraction. Now, if you don't produce alpha-actinin-3, as some people don't, what happens is you lose that structural support and it gets replaced with a protein from slow-twitch muscle. And that has an impact on exercise recovery. There's another interesting gene called the LCT gene, which is a gene that's all to do with the production of lactase. So lactase is the enzyme that gets produced to enable you to digest lactose and therefore consume things like dairy, milk, all that sort of stuff. And that mutation happened in Eastern Europe about 300,000 years ago. And so when you look at European populations, about 70% of European population, 70% of people in Europe will have this gene mutation, which means into adulthood they can consume lactose. Whereas if you go to Asia, almost 100% of them don't have the LCT gene variation, therefore they can't consume lactose. The MCT1 gene is a gene that codes for a protein called MCT1. And this particular protein carries lactic acid or lactate into muscle cells where it gets broken down for energy. Now, some people have a variation of this gene, which means they transport lactate 40% slower. And obviously that has an impact on exercise and has an impact on the time you would spend in certain phases of exercise as well as recovery. There's an interesting gene called PPAR. And PPAR is a gene that codes for proteins that basically enable you to use fat for fuel or become more efficient at using fat for fuel. So, and it gets elevated in endurance exercise, but if you have certain variations of this gene, it means you produce lower amounts of this particular protein, therefore you have more difficulty switching to burn fat for fuel. So if you consume a high carbohydrate diet, it becomes more difficult to actually break into fat oxidation and start to burn body fat. ACE codes for a protein that regulates blood pressure and regulates the reabsorption of salt. Myostatin codes for a protein that's all to do with how your skeletal muscle repairs and grows. I'm not suggesting that simply from one gene result you would start making recommendations about what people should do, but these genes are coding for proteins that actually have an effect that you can start to think about how you could create recommendations against it when it comes to exercise and eating. And the thing that we look at with all of these other DNA tests is we look at these things called SNPs, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So when you look at DNA, it's basically a long line of these small nucleotides. And what we're looking for is changes in these nucleotides that represent these things called SNPs. And that's when we do these microarrays or gene tests, that's what we're ultimately looking at. So has everyone come across this idea of nature versus nurture? And it's kind of always been like a little bit of an argument where people try and create this debate of, is nature most important, is nurture most important, and try and kind of compete them against each other. How we think about nature and nurture is more of like, it's like a value triangle, because, and it's not just with genetics, it's just with all biological data. Nature and nurture aren't important unless you consider a goal. But it's been one of the flaws historically from these big biological tests, because all they do is just dump a load of information on you. And there wasn't necessarily a goal of doing it. But let's say, for example, your goal is that you don't want to get breast cancer. Well, then understanding your BRCA genes becomes important, and then understanding what you can do to stop yourself from getting breast cancer from understanding those BRCA genes is obviously, paramount. So it's not just about nature and nurture, it's actually also about understanding the goal as well. And so in reality, there is things that we know, because we know we have a goal. There are things that we need to understand. We need to understand genetics and other types of biological data. And then we need to understand the environment, both from an impact perspective, i.e. what has the hostility of the environment exerted on you already, and then what actions are you going to take, which is also obviously a reflection of the environment. And then when you kind of consider that even more, then ultimately it's all about adapting. So when it comes to being healthy, when it comes to achieving a physical goal or a fitness related goal, it's always going to be about how do you overcome the hostility of the environment and adapt. And so in understanding the goal, understanding the nature part, and understanding the impact that the environment has already had and how you need to overcome that impact. Have you been exposed to low vitamin D or low levels of zinc or something like that? Genetically, what does that mean? And then what can you do to correct it? It's kind of that kind of cycle, to improve testosterone or improve muscle function. So there's all these things that you have to understand. And so if anything, the main kind of thing from this talk is that if you know the specific questions that you want to ask of your biological data, if you know the specific questions you want to ask of your DNA, then actually you can get some incredible information from it. But if it's all about a more of a generic approach of what can it tell me, well, it can't tell you anything unless you actually know the questions you want to ask of it. And that's kind of the really important thing. And that's hopefully what we'll dig into a little bit more. So applying DNA analysis to exercise and nutrition. When it comes to exercise, and it really doesn't matter what sport you do, it doesn't matter whether you're wanting to get big, lose body fat. When it comes to exercise, there's really only 5 things that are important, 5 adaptations that are important. The first is cardiovascular endurance. So cardiovascular endurance is obviously referring to your heart health and blood vessel health. So from a genetic perspective, is there any information that we could give you when it comes to cardiovascular endurance? And of course there is, because what you have to do then is break down cardiovascular endurance and what do we mean by cardiovascular endurance. So for example, if we're thinking about blood vessels and blood vessel health, we might break down blood vessels and start thinking about smooth muscle function. the purpose, when it comes to exercise, what's really important is that you get lots of blood into working muscles. So you want your blood vessels to be really big. And then you want to get lots of blood out of the muscles because you want to get rid of all the inflammatory products that you build up as a result of exercising. So can we start to, so breaking it down further when it comes to smooth muscle, what then becomes important? Well, we can start thinking about things that would constrict smooth muscle. We can then start thinking about things that will dilate smooth muscle. And then we can start to look at the pathways that will lead to all of these things happening. So from a cardiovascular endurance perspective, are there things that we can talk about from a genetic perspective? There's loads and loads of things that we can talk about, as long as we don't give it the title cardiovascular endurance. We have to give it the title of all the different things that build up to that overall adaptation. Muscular endurance, the ability of a muscle to overcome resistance repetitively over time. Are there things that we can tell you from a genetics perspective about muscular endurance? Well, absolutely. If we start thinking about, for example, the thing I mentioned at the beginning when I was talking about ACTN3, we can look at how quickly a muscle recovers of the force of contraction. So if you wanted to, for example, lift a weight multiple times, in order to overcome the resistance, your muscle has got to recover the force of contraction to be able to do that. Are there things that we can therefore tell you in terms of how you can improve muscular endurance? Yeah, if you break down all of the pathways that would ultimately lead to that improvement in muscular endurance, it might also be how you're able to utilize things like creatine and creatine phosphate, how you're able to utilize other things within the anaerobic period of exercise. There's loads of pathways that we can look at and break down to lead to that adaptation. So again, presenting to you, can genetics improve muscular endurance? Well, it's the same thing, only if you break down all of the pathways that then enable you to contribute to actions that ultimately will lead to that improvement. And it's the same with muscular strength. Can we give you information about that? Absolutely, same mechanism, break down the pathways. Flexibility, can we use genetics to guide how, I don't want to say how you stretch, but how you think about your own flexibility, your own soft tissues? And of course we can, because all of your soft tissues, all of your collagen, all of these kinds of things, they're all formed from proteins that originate from genes. And again, people's variations differ, and therefore tensile strengths of certain tendons might differ as a result of certain gene variations. And there are medical conditions as a result of gene variations that lead to these changes as well. So absolutely. And then finally, body composition. And when it comes to body composition, can you use genetics to guide decisions that you make, whether it's losing body fat, trying to build more muscle, that sort of stuff. And obviously, again, if you break it down into enough steps, you can. If you try and deliver it just as one thing, just off the back of a couple of snips, then obviously you can't. But actually, when you break it all down, you can actually start to discover some really interesting pathways that can lead to some really interesting stuff. And it's the same with nutrition as well. I guess all of you here have kind of seen the sort of the nutrigenomics sector and kind of all the things that kind of popping up in the nutrigenomics sector. There are genuinely lots of very interesting variations and pathways where you can start to give very, very good personalized guidance on how people should eat. So, for example, from a carbohydrate perspective, the information can range from, first of all, understanding the enzymes you produce in your digestive system as to how they will impact your ability to digest certain types of carbohydrates, things like even lactose metabolism and stuff like that, right the way through to understanding, based on knowing what your goal is, how well you will use things like carbohydrates as fuel. Because again, if you're somebody who, let's say you're trying to lose body fat and you know that you don't switch effectively from burning carbohydrates to burning fats, well, then you wouldn't necessarily have somebody like that on a diet with lots of carbohydrate as compared to somebody who doesn't have those issues, where you might potentially want to feed them more carbohydrate, again, depending on what the goal is. When it comes to fats, there's three major fat groups that we look at: monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats. And gene variations and certainly the way you build out traits will determine the percentages of your fat intake in terms of these different types of fat groups. For example, there's an interesting gene called the APO5 gene, which if you consume a diet that's too high in polyunsaturated fats, it actually raises your blood triglycerides. The long-term health impact of that is not really understood, but the point is it's a result of a gene variation that you see this very substantial difference. So again, we can give some pretty interesting information about fat consumption and fat intake. Protein. Protein is the one that is more than any of them goal specific, not just from a physical perspective, but also from a behavioral perspective as well. because we look at gene variations that might predict you might need more protein, let's say if your goal is to build muscle. But protein is a really interesting tool for people who have genetic tendencies that might relate to issues with eating, things like food disinhibition, not being able to demonstrate cognitive restraint with foods, emotional eating, all of these kinds of things. Protein consumption there is not necessarily related to the physical adaptation, if you like, of wanting to build muscle, but actually the appetite suppression measures that actually consuming a lot of protein might have. Or with certain groups of people, how lots of protein in the early parts of the day actually can lead to an increase in energy expenditure, so assist in weight loss, again, for certain types of people. Meal timing and frequency. So if you were somebody who has issues with the control of your appetite, which again is a lot of the time is genetic, then you wouldn't necessarily be recommending just 2 or 3 meals a day, because it's just going to increase the likelihood of them snacking and potentially snacking on the wrong types of foods. So you'd be looking at a higher meal frequency, understanding what the macronutrient ratio should be and whether or not there needs to be any micronutrient intervention. But meal frequency and time and meal timing based on understanding how people's metabolisms work and whether they're metabolically efficient or inefficient. So you're all familiar with this idea of fast and slow metabolisms. When you think about a fast metabolism, if you know someone who would classically describe themselves as having a fast metabolism, they don't go to the toilet more, they don't breathe faster, they don't sweat more, they don't do all of these sorts of things. So in reality, they don't have a fast metabolism. What they have is an inefficient metabolism. Inefficient meaning they consume food, but they don't actually store the energy from the food as people with efficient metabolisms do. So they tend to lose the energy as heat. So have you heard this term as well, skinny fat? It's kind of been the last few years. So skinny fat's really quite interesting because it's classically someone who's very slim, and they might store body fat in, around their tummy or in various other different places. And they'll often say, they find it hard to build muscle, and they can eat whatever they want, and they don't necessarily look bigger, but they just can never get rid of this kind of skinny fat. And with these people, you normally tend to find they do have inefficient metabolisms. And the classic approach of, okay, if you're this person, you want to build more muscle, you need to eat more calories, never works. And this is an example of someone where meal timing becomes important. If you know someone has an inefficient metabolism and they don't store energy effectively, well then these are the people that you need to make sure they have the right pre-workout nutrition and the right post-workout nutrition, so they have energy to work out and energy to recover. There's many different reasons why fasting might be important from a longevity perspective and things like that. But the way we try and think about it, fasting is what are the new bits of information we can contribute to these ideas of fasting. And so, for example, people with inefficient metabolisms, if you only focus their nutrition around when they exercise and they didn't eat the rest of the times, well, actually you're then going to improve their metabolic efficiency. And that's all based on some genes called the uncoupling genes, which are genes that code for these proteins that sit on mitochondria. And it's essentially the transfer of energy into mitochondria that then leads to the energy storage or the energy loss as heat. Micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. So we, as much as possible, we try not to give you a picture or a profile stating that you need to take more of this or you need to take more of this without understanding the impact the environment might have had to determine that. But certainly there are certain vitamins, certain minerals, certain micronutrients, certain supplements, all of these sorts of things that you can actually look at, and you can start to make some predictions based on genetics and based on the traits that we build about whether or not people should supplement with certain things. And obviously that can be related to exercise, but it might even be potentially related to wanting to improve certain cognitive type issues and things like that. Another one would be something like caffeine. And we're going to go into caffeine a little bit as well, but caffeine is super interesting. It's one of the most consumed beverages in the West, and there's a whole host of interesting genetics around caffeine. In terms of can you use DNA analysis to guide exercise prescription and nutrition and supplement prescription, you can do that. But again, if we go back to what I was saying, you need to really understand all of the points on the pathway to know exactly what you're making a recommendation against. It's often quite easy for, we can be kind of told to do something, and it could be something as simple as saying, eat this carbohydrate. But the reality is every carbohydrate you eat might be going through 180 different chemical processes before that you actually get anything from it that you require. So when you understand to that level all of the different things that could happen, you can then start to create much better, or give people better ideas about what it is that they should do. Sometimes when I'm talking about DNA testing, people sometimes have this kind of idea in the back of their minds that maybe it's all to do with how can you do gene doping and all that kind of stuff. And I think gene doping is quite interesting. And the only reason I bring it up is because, well, there are certainly genes in the world at the moment that people are trying to figure out ways if they can essentially dope with them. And this is why WADA in 2008 tried to start to come up with some guidelines about gene doping. Because, for example, there's a gene called EPO, which codes for your kidneys to produce something called erythropoietin. And erythropoietin leads to the production of red blood cells and hemoglobin, which means if you produce more hemoglobin, you're going to carry more oxygen, and that's potentially going to make you pretty good when it comes to endurance type activities. So there was always these ideas about if you could dope somebody with the EPO gene and get them to produce more hemoglobin, then maybe you could make them better athletes. And actually in the 70s, there was a skier whose name I always forget, a Finnish skier, and he had a condition called primary polycythemia, which was where he had a gene variation in the EPO gene, which meant he produced massive amounts of hemoglobin. And for that reason, he was the cross-country ski champion of the world for many, many, many years. He could never be beaten. And as a result of having this particular gene variation. The one thing is, though, they did try to put this particular gene variation into rats, and it made their blood go like sludge, so they actually weren't particularly good athletes after all. Other interesting ones, IGF-1. So IGF-1 specifically, you've all heard of the condition muscular dystrophy. So it's a condition where there's mutation in the deficiency of a protein called dystrophin, which is essentially acts as structural support in muscle. And one of the things that they were trying to investigate is what could they do with regards to trying to have some sort of genetic implementation where they could improve the symptoms of muscular dystrophy. And what they did was injected mice with a version of the IGF-1 gene that meant they overproduced IGF-1. And not only did this completely get rid of the muscular dystrophy symptoms and mitigate the fact they weren't producing dystrophin, but also later in life, those particular mice were stronger than mice that didn't have muscular dystrophy. So one of the things that you are going to see, we're seeing all sorts of interesting gene technologies appearing at the moment where people are trying to cut genomes and insert things into genomes and all that sort of stuff. From a performance perspective, I would say in the next 20 years, if you all stay involved and engaged in biohacking, there's going to be a frontier of people where they start talking about how can you use viral vectors to put these special gene variations into you that potentially give superhuman type performance and properties. At the moment, we don't do that. We'll never do that. But it's always good to understand some of these genes and some of these things that people are thinking about doping with, because it gives us a focus of understanding what we might be doing our own research against to understand where we can take action to improve the function of these particular genes. With regards to me personally and the people that I work with, the things that we're really interested in are performance and recovery, cardiovascular health, hormones, and inflammation. The way we think about genetic information and the way we present genetic information is we ultimately build traits. When I say that we build traits, we use lots and lots of SNPs by understanding the pathways that lead to certain things, and we build them out knowing biometric details about an individual as well to ultimately deliver people these kind of SNPs and then the actions that you can take against some of these SNP results. One of the ones that I thought that we would have a little bit more of an in-depth look at is nitric oxide. So who has heard of nitric oxide? Who's familiar with it? And for what reasons are you familiar with it? Just shout some reasons out. Okay, yeah. Sorry? Blood pressure, yeah. Nitric oxide is really interesting, and what you've just said there is super interesting as well, because for the last 15 years, one of the big things that supplement companies have been trying to build into their products is nitric oxide boosters. And this really stems from, in the 90s, there were two American scientists that got the Nobel Prize for their work with nitric oxide for its basically a discovery as it being this incredibly important molecule that has significant positive effects on blood vessel health and therefore cardiovascular health. Have you all heard of like GTN and nitrate sprays for people that you might know with heart conditions and stuff like that? They're basically things that produce nitric oxide. So when you look at a blood vessel is divided into layers. The innermost layer is the layer called the endothelium, and then you have basically muscular layers after that. So the endothelium, and then with smooth muscle layers after it. And the interesting thing about the endothelium is it produces this molecule called nitric oxide. And the effect of nitric oxide is that it diffuses through the endothelium into the smooth muscle, and it causes the smooth muscle to dilate or relax. It causes the smooth muscle to relax, which means that the blood vessel dilates, and therefore it can either be carrying more blood into or more blood away from working muscles. So it's a really important molecule. And this kind of diagram here, which I'm going to talk through, is a little bit simplistic, but it's really kind of just to highlight a specific point. So there's an enzyme called NOS3 or eNOS, and this particular enzyme within your endothelium produces nitric oxide. But in order to produce nitric oxide, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that needs to happen first. Now, I also want to use this to highlight how it's also it's easy sometimes for us to follow guidance without actually breaking it down far enough to know whether or not the guidance is right. So classically in pre-workout products or workout supplements, you'll find that they contain a lot of either arginine or L-citrulline, and this is what they will claim is the thing that leads to the increase in nitric oxide. Now, L-citrulline and arginine, basically, they're kind of the best way to think about it is it's almost one and the same thing. When you supplement with arginine, most of the time you can't actually you can't absorb it, so you don't actually get much arginine. But when you supplement with L-citrulline, it actually leads to an increase in the conversion of arginine within the endothelium. So most people would take L-citrulline or arginine, believing that this is going to improve their nitric oxide production or nitric oxide function. Without understanding the things that would ultimately lead to that before the arginine and L-citrulline, it's hard to know whether that is the right action to take. When it comes to synthesizing nitric oxide, something that's really important is something called BH4, which is the short name of something called tetrahydrobiopterin. Now, BH4 is a cofactor for NOS3. So in order for an arginine to be converted into nitric oxide, BH4 has to bind to NOS3. And that will lead to the production of nitric oxide. BH4 in that process gets reduced down into something called BH2, and then BH2 would then go through a process of being recycled to reform BH4. And so there's kind of this short cycle that's kind of happening there. So understanding a little bit about BH4 genetics, about BH2 genetics, about NOS3 genetics, and even potentially about arginine genetics, might start to give us some idea of the actions that someone's to take if they actually really do want to improve their nitric oxide. So BH4 synthesis, there's a whole bunch of genes that relate to BH4 synthesis. There's a whole bunch of genes and SNPs that relate to nitric oxide synthesis, and there's a whole bunch that relate to BH4 recycling, which is the BH2 component. The reason this is important is that not only is it important for the production of nitric oxide for all the benefits that has, but also BH2, if you don't convert it back into BH4, one of the problems that happens there is you end up, BH2 will then bind to NOS3, and it starts producing superoxides and free radicals, which is obviously damaging to cells and can lead to a whole bunch of consequences that you simply don't want to happen. Let's imagine 3 people. So we've got person A who has good BH4 synthesis, he or she has got good nitric oxide synthesis, and they've got good BH4 recycling. And then person B, who is bad for BH4 synthesis, bad for BH4 recycling, but good for nitric oxide synthesis. And then person C, who is bad for BH4 synthesis, bad for recycling, and good for nitric oxide synthesis. How would their actions differ based on kind of a genetic analysis? What would we tell them that would be different? So basically, why do we even need to know all of this information? Person A is the person who has good BH4 synthesis. So one of the things we might say to them is just avoid large amounts of phenylalanine. And the reason that we would say that is that BH4 is also used for a couple of other different reactions as well. So it converts phenylalanine into tyrosine, it converts tryptophan into serotonin. And so if you're wanting to maximize the amount of nitric oxide someone produces, then you probably want to try and minimize the alternative uses of BH4. For BH4 recycling, for person A, they don't have any issues, so we might just say reduce your intake of tyramine-containing foods. The reason is that tyramine is a vasoconstrictor, so rather than giving them stuff that's going to constrict blood vessels, we just want to keep them dilated. And nitric oxide synthesis, that's good as well, so we might just want them to consume more foods that are going to increase their dietary nitrate intake, which might mean there are other mechanisms as well that can improve nitric oxide production. For person B, might say the same thing, avoid large amounts of phenylalanine. Because they don't have good BH4 recycling, we might say increase your intake of antioxidants. The reason for that, obviously, is that if they've got large amounts of BH2 and it binds to NOS3, it's going to produce free radicals and superoxides. And considering they have good nitric oxide synthesis, we might just say eat lots of pomegranate, because pomegranate contains substances that actually reduce the breakdown of nitric oxide and potentially promote or enhance the function of nitric oxide synthesis. Person C, who is bad for BH4 synthesis recycling, but it's good nitric oxide, we might say keep your intake of tyrosine containing foods high. So phenylalanine gets converted to tyrosine. If you've got lots of tyrosine, then there's less of a need for dietary phenylalanine to be converted to it. So there's less use of BH4 there. They have bad BH4 recycling, so we might tell them to supplement with methylfolate. The reason is that if you have the gene variations which mean you don't convert BH2 back to BH4 effectively, using methylated folate actually mimics the actions of that enzyme that would lead to that change. So supplementing methylfolate will increase that conversion back to BH4. The other thing that we'd want to do is, rather than tell them to consume lots of nitrates from foods, we might tell them to limit their use of mouthwash, because mouthwash kills bacteria in your mouth that actually lead to the formation of nitrates from some of the foods that you consume. So lots of different things that you would tell people differently based on knowing the genetics and knowing the pathways that lead to the production of nitric oxide. And there are other things as well. I mean, the SNPs that relate to arginine and how we'll use arginine might affect whether or not you would tell someone to supplement with L-citrulline or supplement with arginine. In terms of the extension of this pathway, this becomes a pathway that's really all about understanding smooth muscle contraction. So when you start to build into this as well, calcium regulation, start thinking about bradykinin and a whole load of other things, a whole load of other pathways, you can start to see how you can really optimize blood vessel function. So from a biohacking perspective, not only is this relevant for your exercise performance, not only is it relevant for your recovery, but think about places where smooth muscle exists, where this kind of thing might be important. You've obviously got blood vessels in your brain, you've got smooth muscle in your guts. It's kind of everywhere. So these sorts of understanding these kinds of things becomes really, really important. Second one that I just thought we'd go into a little bit as well is coffee. So are you all coffee drinkers? Anyone who isn't a coffee drinker? Okay, cool. The interesting thing with coffee is that we've known for a long time that coffee improves ergonomic performance, sports performance, exercise, etc. There's certainly lots of studies that have demonstrated that. But they never demonstrate 100% of people benefit from caffeine or coffee before exercise. And actually, for a long time, there's always been a bit of a lack of an understanding why it is some people just don't get any ergonomic benefits from caffeine or coffee before they exercise. And more, as people kind of started to expose genomics and expose genetics a little bit more, they started to figure out some reasons why. A lot of the early work with regards to coffee genetics actually stemmed from work in breast cancer. So the specific genes that break down or metabolize coffee are also the same genes that metabolize estrogen. And so in the early work on the CYP genes with breast cancer, they kind of also discovered this link and interest that relates to coffee. And actually there's some really cool statistics and information that came out of that. With coffee or with caffeine, perhaps talk about caffeine now. Caffeine gets broken down into three metabolites: paraxanthin, theobromine, and theophylline. Has anyone in here heard of theophylline? And what's the reason you've heard of theophylline?
Medication.
Yeah, that's right, for asthma. Yeah, absolutely. So theophyline's important because theophylline relaxes smooth muscle. There was actually a paper last year that came out. I mean, we've long thought this actually, but there was a paper last year that came out that actually said that it might be that some of the performance benefits you see from caffeine isn't actually coming from what we originally thought it was coming from, but it could be coming from things like theophylline that's just causing, smooth muscle relaxation, which means you can breathe better, and potentially it might activate some of the adrenergic receptors in blood vessels as well that might make them relax and therefore increase blood flow. That's not not certain though. But when caffeine gets broken down, paraxanthin binds to adenosine receptors in the hypothalamus that ultimately causes the release from your pituitary gland of ACTH that then stimulates your adrenals to release catecholamines, so adrenaline, noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine. The effects of caffeine, they kind of come from different things. Now, caffeine itself, if caffeine's circulating in your blood, does that have the same effect as its metabolites? And actually, it has different effects in different places. So whereas, for example, paraxanthin, when it's broken down, might ultimately lead to the relaxation of blood vessels in your brain, for example, caffeine actually causes the constriction of blood vessels in your brain. So until it's broken down, it can have different actions and different kind of stuff that happens. And therefore, knowing how fast you break down caffeine, actually from a performance perspective and from a hacking perspective, is potentially pretty important. And we look at a number of genes that relate to how fast you break caffeine down. But then this is important because it can start to give you some ideas about how you can use caffeine or coffee or things like that relating to exercise or relating to everyday human performance. So person A is a slow metabolizer of caffeine and person B is a fast metabolizer. So how would that affect recommendations that you might give them? So someone metabolizes caffeine fast, so for example like person B, and they're going to break down the caffeine really quickly on the basis that they haven't already consumed lots of caffeine and therefore exhausted their adrenals and they're not producing the catecholamines anymore and stuff like that. On the basis that hasn't happened, this might be an example of someone where you would say 10 or 15 minutes before you work out, have some caffeine, have a coffee, wherever you're getting your caffeine from, it's totally fine. And that will probably have some pretty good performance benefits, whether it's a workout, whether it's an event, whatever it is. It probably will have some benefits. If they have it too long before the activity, then their energy levels are potentially going to crash by the time they get to the activity. So that's kind of why you might recommend it a little bit closer. But for person A, would you recommend the same thing? And you probably wouldn't, because if they break down caffeine slowly, and therefore there is no guarantee they're going to get the performance benefits because there's no guarantee they're going to get the breakdown fast enough into the things that might be causing the benefits in the first place. Again, it's not 100%, but it's what people are theorizing. Well, then that wouldn't be a good thing. Now, there was some research that was carried out, well, it's been carried out now for a number of years, but it was reported last year, where they were looking at people who were having heart attacks, so known heart disease, who were having heart attacks and they were dying as a result of the heart attacks. And they were trying to establish whether or not, they were trying to look at what might be the factors that were relating to this. Why is it some people have heart attacks and live, some people have heart attacks and die? And one of the things that they found in the sample group they were looking at, where it was people with known heart disease having heart attacks and drank coffee, all of them that had heart attacks following knowing they had heart disease, they were all slow metabolizers of caffeine. And one of the things that they think was happening was that because they break down caffeine so slowly, caffeine is constantly basically causing smooth muscle to constrict and potentially even triggering points in the heart as well, making it beat faster, tighten up the blood vessels, and therefore leading to increased coronary artery disease and essentially having heart attacks and dying. From a health perspective and from a performance perspective, understanding if someone is a slow metabolizer of caffeine potentially has some really interesting actions and statements of what they should do. Avoiding caffeine before and immediately after exercise. I'm not saying they can't drink coffee or can't drink caffeine, but you just wouldn't have it necessarily around going and doing a bout of exercise. Or maybe the type of exercise. If you're going to go and do heavy lifting or powerlifting where there's a lot of breath holding and things like that, you definitely wouldn't want to have something that's causing vasoconstriction, because you will end up bursting arteries and retinal vessels and all that sort of stuff. So. And then finally, one of the things that I said that we were also interested in as well is sex hormones, specifically testosterone and estrogen. In keeping with what I've kind of said, if you can understand lots of points on a pathway and you can actually build actions against lots of points on a pathway, then actually genetic information potentially becomes very useful. In fact, just biological data generally becomes very, very useful. So when it comes to sex hormones, that's exactly what we've done. We've started to take a look at some of the individual pathways that ultimately lead to the desirable and not desirable effects of how the environment might affect sex hormones. I remember a few years back, I was listening to Tony Robbins, and one of the things that he said is when it comes to people, in order to influence somebody, you've got to know what already influences them. And specifically with the sex hormones, I always think it's so important to know already what influences sex hormones. Forget about genetics, just what is it that influences them in the environment. And then if you can add the genetics layer on as well, you can really start to deliver some actions about what people should do, knowing certain things. So with testosterone, what are the things that we can think of that would have an impact on somebody's testosterone? So there's obviously the synthesis of testosterone in the first place. And when we think about synthesis, we think about everything ranging from cholesterol right the way through to various different enzyme reactions that ultimately would lead to the production of free testosterone or the conversion to dihydrotestosterone, which is the more potent version. And so there's lots of points along the synthesis pathway that we can genetically predict against, as well as understand that are impacted by other things. The steroid hormone binding globulins are the proteins that carry they carry the sex hormones, but carry testosterone around the blood. Obviously, if you produce lots of steroid hormone binding globulin, there's less free testosterone and therefore less testosterone to exert an effect. If you don't have a lot of steroid hormone binding globulin and you have lots of free testosterone, it's bad for a female because it means you're likely to suffer with hirsutism. It's bad for a male because you're likely to start to develop symptoms of high estrogen from the conversion because you've got too high free testosterone. And then all of the other things that we know along the way that impact testosterone. So if you have a lot of body fat, it means will convert a lot of your testosterone to estrogen. If you're older, if you have a bad lifestyle, don't sleep particularly well, if your activity level's low, and if you're deficient in certain micronutrients, zinc, magnesium, vitamin D3, all of these sorts of things, it's going to impact your ability to produce testosterone and certainly to have healthy testosterone levels for both males and females. So another example where all of these points along the way, from a biological data perspective, we can start to create actions by understanding these different kind of points and different phases. Estrogen's exactly the same thing. Estrogen is it's the same biological pathways that lead to the production of estrogen. Obviously, for men, testosterone is the sexual characteristic producing hormone. For females, it's estrogen. But both men and women need testosterone and estrogen just in different levels. And there are different points in time where production changes, why we need it changes. But again, it's the same thing. If we understand how it gets produced, how it's synthesized, all of the points of impact and what the actions we can take, we can start to tell people exactly the things that they need to do in order to maximize, from a sex hormone perspective, how they can get the greatest value from sex hormones, whether it's increasing or decreasing the sex hormone binding globulins or anything that they can alter along the way, recognizing they might also have some other conditions. Just in summary, genetic testing, it has a huge role in the future of biohacking and the future of health as part of lots of other types of biological assessments that we can start to merge the data together and really build models of an individual at any particular point in time. But it needs to be used wisely and it needs to be used in a way that's well understood for it to actually have any significant meaning.
All right, guys, we're going to have to go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.